What happens when America's most beloved morning show host goes head-to-head with royalty in what was supposed to be a friendly interview? Well, buckle up, because what you're about to witness is television history in the making. Meghan Markle walked into Studio 1 Ampere expecting the usual softball questions. But Savannah Guthrie had other plans. This wasn't just an interview. This was a masterclass in journalism meeting its match, and someone who refuses to back down. Make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about live television. The morning started like any other at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Savannah Guthrie was reviewing her notes one final time, her producer reminding her of the key talking points they wanted to cover. The Duchess of Sussex was scheduled for a 12-minute segment to discuss her latest charitable endeavors, a seemingly routine booking that had taken months to coordinate. But something felt different in the air that morning, an electricity that veteran television professionals recognize when they know they're about to witness something extraordinary. Meghan arrived precisely on time, her security detail creating the usual commotion that accompanies high-profile guests. She looked immaculate as always, wearing a navy blazer that commanded respect while maintaining approachability. Her team had spent weeks preparing for this appearance, coaching her on key messages and potential landmines to avoid. They believed they had every angle covered, every possible question anticipated and rehearsed. Savannah greeted her warmly in the green room, the kind of professional courtesy that puts guests at ease before they go live to millions of viewers. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather, about New York, about the early morning schedule that both women knew all too well. But beneath Savannah's smile was the mind of a seasoned journalist who had been doing her homework, digging deeper than the surface-level talking points that publicists prefer to stick to. The countdown began, and both women took their positions on the iconic Today Show set. Meghan had done hundreds of interviews by this point in her life. From her acting days through her time as a working royal and beyond, she understood the rhythm of morning television. The need to be engaging but not controversial, informative but not too revealing. Savannah, meanwhile, had built her reputation on asking the questions that others might shy away from. Always with a smile, but never without substance. The cameras rolled and Savannah opened with her trademark warmth, welcoming Meghan to the show and thanking her for taking the time to join them. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded exactly as expected. They discussed Meghan's upcoming charity gala, her work with women's empowerment organizations, and her thoughts on motherhood in the public eye. Meghan's responses were polished, heartfelt, and perfectly crafted for the morning television audience. But Savannah had been watching the clock, and she knew that the real conversation was about to begin. As they approached the halfway point of the segment, she shifted in her chair slightly, a movement so subtle that most viewers wouldn't notice, but that Meghan's media training had taught her to recognize as a signal that the tone was about to change. "Meghan, I have to ask you about something that's been on a lot of people's minds," Savannah said, her voice maintaining its friendly tone, but with an undercurrent of determination that suggested she wasn't going to accept a non-answer. "There have been ongoing reports about tensions within your family, particularly regarding your relationship with your father. Some critics have suggested that your public statements have been inconsistent with your private actions. How do you respond to those who say you've been selective with the truth?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for just a moment, Meghan's perfectly composed expression flickered. She had expected tough questions, but this was more direct than her team had anticipated. The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras and the barely audible whispers of crew members who sensed they were witnessing something significant. Meghan took a breath, her media training kicking in as she formulated her response. But there was something in Savannah's eyes, a journalist's instinct that suggested she had more follow-up questions ready, that this wasn't going to be as simple as delivering a prepared statement and moving on to safer ground. "Savannah, I think that's a really unfair characterization, Meghan replied, her voice steady, but with a slight edge that hadn't been there moments before. My relationship with my father is complicated, as many family relationships are, and I've always been honest about that complexity. What I won't do is allow others to dictate how I should navigate deeply personal family matters based on speculation and tabloid reporting. Savannah nodded, but her expression made it clear she wasn't satisfied with that response. But Meghan, you've spoken publicly about your father on multiple occasions, including in that prime-time interview where you discussed feeling abandoned by him. Yet, court documents from your legal battles with the British press suggest a very different timeline of events. Can you explain those discrepancies? The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Meghan's team, watching from the wings, exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't the direction they had expected the interview to take, and they could see their carefully crafted media strategy beginning to unravel in real time. I'm not sure what discrepancies you're referring to, Meghan said, but her tone had shifted noticeably. The warmth that had characterized her earlier responses was replaced by something more guarded, more defensive. Everything I've said publicly about my father has been truthful and from the heart. Well, let me be specific, Savannah continued, consulting her notes with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. In your interview, you mentioned that your father stopped taking your calls weeks before your wedding, but text messages that were submitted as evidence in your privacy lawsuit show that you were in contact with him much closer to the wedding date, and that some of those conversations were quite contentious. Were you being completely forthcoming about the timeline of events? Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but the cameras caught it. Millions of viewers watching at home could sense the shift in dynamics. The way the interview had transformed from a friendly chat into something resembling a cross-examination. This was no longer about charity work and motherhood. This was about credibility and truth. Savannah, I think you're taking legal documents out of context, Meghan replied, her voice growing colder. Those text messages were private communications that were never meant to be public, and they were presented in a very specific legal context that doesn't reflect the full picture of what was happening in my life at that time. But they are your words, aren't they? Savannah pressed, leaning forward slightly. And they do contradict some of the statements you've made publicly about your relationship with your father. I'm just trying to understand how viewers should reconcile those differences. The studio audience, small as it was, could feel the tension building. This was the kind of moment that morning television rarely produces when the veneer of politeness gives way to something more raw and authentic. Meghan's publicist was frantically texting her assistant, trying to figure out how to salvage what was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. I think what you're doing right now is exactly the problem, Meghan said, her composure finally beginning to crack. You're taking private family communications and trying to use them as some kind of gotcha moment. These are real people, real relationships, real pain. This isn't a game show where you get points for catching someone in an inconsistency. Savannah remained calm, her years of experience serving her well in this high-pressure moment. Meghan, I understand that these are sensitive topics, but you've chosen to speak publicly about these relationships. When public figures make public statements, especially ones that generate significant media coverage and public sympathy, don't they have a responsibility to be accurate and complete in their accounts? Are you questioning my integrity? Meghan asked, her voice rising slightly for the first time since the interview began. The question wasn't really a question at all. It was a challenge, a line drawn in the sand that dared Savannah to cross it. I'm asking for clarification, Savannah replied evenly. Because these discrepancies matter. They matter to your credibility. They matter to the public's understanding of the events you've described. And they matter to other family members who may have different recollections of what happened. Meghan sat back in her chair, her eyes flashing with something that looked dangerously close to anger. The woman who had walked into the studio as America's sympathetic duchess was transforming before viewers' eyes into someone far more combative, far less controlled than anyone had expected to see on morning television. "You know what, Savannah?" Meghan said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if she had shouted. "I came here in good faith to talk about the work I'm doing to help others, to discuss causes that matter to me and to millions of people around the world. Instead, you've chosen to ambush me with tabloid journalism disguised as legitimate questioning." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Savannah's professional smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. She had been called many things in her career, but never a tabloid journalist, and certainly not to her face on live television. Meghan, with respect, asking follow-up questions about public statements. "Isn't tabloid journalism? It's journalism," Savannah replied, her voice remaining steady even as the tension in the studio reached a breaking point. When someone speaks publicly about deeply personal matters, and those statements become part of the public record, it's fair to ask for clarification when new information emerges that seems to contradict earlier accounts. Meghan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed like she might simply stand up and walk off the set. The producers in the control room were holding their breath, knowing they were witnessing either a career-defining moment for their host or a public relations disaster that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. "You want to talk about what's fair?" Meghan shot back, her voice now carrying a sharp edge that cut through the studio's carefully maintained atmosphere of morning show pleasantness. "What's fair is allowing someone to tell their story without having every word dissected and analyzed by people who weren't there, who don't know the full context, and who seem more interested in creating controversy than understanding truth." Savannah leaned forward, her journalistic instincts fully engaged now. "But Meghan, you've built much of your public platform on telling your story. You've done prime-time interviews. You've written memoirs. You've spoken at length about your experiences. When you put your story into the public sphere, especially when it involves other people who may not have the same platform to respond, don't you invite scrutiny?" "Scrutiny?" "Yes," Meghan replied, her composure hanging by a thread. "Character assassination disguised as journalism. No, there's a difference between asking legitimate questions and what you're doing right now, which feels like you came into this interview with a predetermined narrative, and you're trying to force me into it regardless of what I actually say." The accusation was serious, and Savannah knew it. Her reputation, built over decades of careful, thoughtful journalism, was being questioned on live television by one of the most watched figures in the world. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Meghan, I came into this interview with questions that I believe our viewers deserve to have answered. You've made very serious allegations about racism within the British royal family. You've described feeling suicidal during your time as a working royal. And you've painted yourself as a victim of a system that treated you unfairly. These are extraordinary claims that have had real-world consequences for real people. Shouldn't extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence?" Meghan's face flushed, and for a moment the mask of media-trained perfection slipped completely. "Are you seriously questioning whether I experienced racism? Are you questioning whether I felt suicidal? Because if that's what you're doing, Savannah, then we have a much bigger problem here than just journalistic standards." "I'm not questioning your experiences," Savannah replied carefully, aware that the conversation had entered dangerous territory. "I'm asking about the specifics of your accounts, about the timeline of events, about the discrepancies between what you've said publicly and what other evidence suggests." "That's not the same thing." "It absolutely is the same thing," Meghan shot back, her voice rising again. "When you question the details, you're questioning the validity of the entire experience. When you parse my words, looking for inconsistencies, you're suggesting that I'm either lying or confused about my own life. Do you have any idea how that feels?" The studio fell completely silent, except for the hum of electronics and the barely audible breathing of crew members who were afraid to move. This had gone far beyond a typical morning show interview. This was a confrontation between two strong-willed women who represented very different approaches to truth and accountability. "Meghan, I understand that this is difficult," Savannah said, her voice softening slightly but maintaining its firmness. "But difficulty doesn't exempt anyone from having their public statements examined. You've accused people of racism. You've suggested that an institution failed to protect you. You've implied that your mental health crisis was ignored or dismissed. These accusations have consequences. They affect people's reputations. They influence public opinion. They shape how millions of people view important institutions. And they're all true," Meghan replied, her voice now shaking with barely controlled emotion. "Every single thing I've said about my experiences is true. The fact that you're sitting here trying to poke holes in my story, while people who were actually there, who actually witnessed what happened, remain silent, tells me everything I need to know about where your priorities lie." Savannah paused, recognizing that they had reached a crucial moment. She could back down, apologize, and try to salvage what remained of the interview. Or she could press forward, knowing that doing so might create an even bigger spectacle, but potentially get to something resembling truth. "Meghan, you say that people who were there remained silent, but that's not entirely accurate, is it? Palace sources have disputed some of your accounts. Other members of your family have offered different versions of events and documentary evidence, like those text messages we discussed earlier. Sometimes tells a different story than your public statements. How do you reconcile all of that?" Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the studio floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. For a moment, it looked like she might actually walk off the set, creating the kind of viral moment that would be replayed endlessly on social media and cable news. "You know what, Savannah?" she said, her voice now cold and controlled in a way that was somehow more unsettling than her earlier displays of emotion. "I see exactly what this is. You invited me here under false pretenses. You told my team this would be about my charitable work, about the positive impact we're trying to make in the world. Instead, you've turned this into an interrogation based on gossip, speculation, and leaked private communications." "Meghan, please sit down," Savannah said, maintaining her professional demeanor, even as she realized the interview was spiraling completely out of control. "These aren't false pretenses. We did want to talk about your charitable work, and we did. But when public figures make newsworthy statements, it's our job to ask follow-up questions." Meghan remained standing, her posture rigid with indignation. "Your job is supposed to be informing the public, not ambushing guests with gotcha questions designed to make them look dishonest or inconsistent. What you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's entertainment masquerading as news." The insult landed like a physical blow, and for the first time in the interview, Savannah's composure cracked slightly. "Meghan, I've been doing this job for over 2 decades. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, Nobel Prize winners, and countless other newsmakers. I don't ambush people. I ask hard questions because our viewers deserve honest answers." "Hard questions?" Meghan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "These aren't hard questions. These are hostile questions. There's a difference between challenging someone and trying to humiliate them on national television. And right now, it's very clear which one you've chosen to do." Savannah took a deep breath, knowing that how she handled the next few moments would define not just this interview, but potentially her entire career. "Meghan, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I stand by every question I've asked. When someone makes public statements that contradict documented evidence, when someone levels serious accusations without providing substantiation, when someone's story changes depending on the audience, these are legitimate areas of inquiry." "My story has never changed," Meghan replied, her voice now dangerously quiet. What's changed is people's willingness to twist my words, to take things out of context, to prioritize sensationalism over truth. And what you're doing right now is a perfect example of that. The two women stared at each other across the small studio space, the weight of their confrontation settling over everyone present. This wasn't just about Meghan Markle or Savannah Guthrie anymore. This was about something larger, about truth and accountability in an age where both seem increasingly elusive. Finally, Savannah spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades earning the right to ask difficult questions. Meghan, I respect your right to tell your story, but with that right comes responsibility. Responsibility to be accurate, to be complete, and to be accountable when questions arise about your account. That's not persecution, and that's just how public discourse works in a free society. Meghan slowly sat back down, but her body language made it clear that she was far from surrendering. And I respect your right to ask questions, Savannah. But with that right also comes responsibility. Responsibility to be fair, to provide context, and to remember that behind every story you're dissecting are real human beings with real feelings and real consequences to face long after your camera stopped rolling. The interview concluded with both women maintaining their positions, neither willing to concede ground to the other as the credits rolled and the cameras finally stopped. The studio remained charged with an energy that everyone present would remember for years to come. So, there you have it, one of the most explosive morning television interviews in recent memory. Two powerful women, each convinced of their own righteousness, clashing in a way that revealed as much about our current media landscape as it did about the individuals involved. What did you think of how both Meghan and Savannah handled this confrontation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories that you won't see anywhere else. Which moment from this interview surprised you the